artist as opposed to a curator. So my perspective is slightly different, I think, than our panelists, but we have a really great group of people to speak with. I'm not going to go through their bios because they're in your packet, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about how we came to the form for the panel that we're going to have today. Each of the presenters is going to present for 5 minutes, and they're going to present a kind of a meditation on a set of words that they chose through our discussions in preparing for this that reflect the ideas, issues that they're thinking about in their own work right now. So I'm going to introduce each panelist with their name and their 3 words, and then each of them will come up and present for 5 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion at this beautiful table. So we have Anuradha Vikram. Her words are action, developing, communal. We have Lisa Mahadi, consciousness, wild, feminine. We have Megha Ralapati, generosity, unlearning, invention. We have Namita Gupta Wiggers, and her words are a phrase, American, yes, and craft. We have Jasmine Wahi, multi-positional, spicy, intersectional feminism, and my 3 words are intersectional, imagination, and intimacy. And we're not going to be, Jayshree is not going to be able to join us for the panel today, but we all will be thinking of her and channeling her in our conversation and presentations. So with that, these are the words. With that, I'm going to welcome Namita up to the podium.
Stand off to the side or turn that down, otherwise no one will see me. Okay, thank you so much. Good morning. So the first word I want to talk about is craft. And that's because craft is the area that I have been working in since probably about 1997. When I ran away from graduate school in art history at University of Chicago to become a metalsmith. And I did that for a number of years, and then most recently was at a museum. But before I do that, I want to share a story with you all. I want to tell you that I live in Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon is one of the whitest cities in the entire country. And there are 2 of us here, Avantika Wawa and myself, who live in Portland and are mistaken for each other all the time. So that gives you a sense of the kind of audience that we are working with in terms of curatorial work. I also want to share with you that I lived in New Jersey from age 7 until 14, and in 1974 when we moved here, it was this moment when everybody's brothers, cousins, sisters, brother-in-law was flying through New York. And they would call my mom and say, please meet them at the airport, take them around New York City and put them on the plane to Des Moines, San Francisco, San Diego, wherever they were going. So for about 3 years, we were in the city no less than 1 or 2 times a month, picking people up, helping them go places. I thought this was my mother's job at some point. But the thing that happened is I ended up spending all my time in museums because my mom felt, coming from a British boarding school in Darjeeling, that the way to teach people about American culture was to show them a grocery store and to walk them through museums. So museums are very much a part of who I am and my identity. So when the opportunity came up to be able to work in a museum, to define a new way of thinking about craft, I jumped at it because it seemed like an opportunity to change the field from within, to take the training and experiences that I've had in contemporary art and put them in a different place. So that's why I work through craft. I want to touch briefly on some of the kinds of things I do in my curatorial practice. I believe in making space. I believe in listening, and I believe in asking questions. And those 3 things are what guide everything that I do in my curatorial work. They guided everything I did in my museum education work. This exhibition was about the bowl. Design owns the chair, the lamp, and the table. People own the bowl. So how do you take a bowl, a common humble object, and disrupt a museum by focusing on the bowl? Well, you circulate objects, and you let people take the objects home, you let them document their own stories, and you let them give you their stories, and you post them on a Tumblr site. So two, you disrupt the idea that museums only produce exhibitions that are documented in the form of catalogs. Instead, you make space. You take strategies that are out there for distribution of information and you equalize the playing field. So on this Tumblr site, you have a story about a chai cup and you also have a story about Ai Weiwei dropping a bowl, for example. Those aren't really examples that are on there, but that gives you the sense. Everybody has an equal voice, but you have multiple voices. So this is the kind of work that I've been trying to do in my practice through museums. Sorry, and that's the yes and. I forgot to say that. Let me go back for one second. That's the yes and. When an artist comes to me and says, I want to do an exhibition that's 6 months long, it takes 6 residents, and starts out absolutely with an empty museum, I say yes and let's figure out how to make that work. So it's about being artist-centric and community-centric as well. The last thing is this question about being American. I am American. I am unabashedly American. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I have only been to India 2 or 3 times. I lived in India for 8 months when I was 10 years old. So my other practice is to redefine what American means, to take this position when I'm given the chance to curate and to shift that around, not just within so-called mainstream institutions, because I've made a deliberate choice to work for small institutions. I think small museums are where we have an opportunity to have a bigger voice. And if you think about the long tail theory, down here in the long tail is where we could make more noise in smaller institutions than trying to get the bigger ones to change what they're doing. With that, these are 2 exhibitions that I did. One at the Asian American Museum in Seattle, which surprisingly did not include a lot of South Asian work in it. And a second project where I brought in work from the diaspora. And I'm happy to talk to you all more specifically, but I'm sharing these just as examples of the way in which you can disrupt from within. So thank you.
Okay, you can hear me now. All right. I'm doing something different, so hopefully you will appreciate it. It's a piece I wrote called On Kings, Films, and Astral Nomads, a script for cave painting, a Sufi Fluxus production. Somewhere woven within the fabric of the universe, at an unmarked location, imperceptible to the human race, and their peculiar reptilian brains, King Amanullah Khan ponders his earthly grind during the 2nd decade of the 20th century in Afghanistan. He's asked to evaluate himself as an interplanetary being to determine whether he's ready to join a special plane where astral nomads dwell. There he would join the great energetic body, becoming one with all. However, this self-evaluation process requires that he converses with a crossover of consequential figures across many folds of time so that his spirit as a being and his performance as a king are most thoroughly and objectively appraised. Alexander the Great is the first volunteer to offer his introspection for the king. He criticizes Amanullah's choice to send a dozen artists to study art in a place later known as Germany. The great warrior asked, why not choose a place outside of your own genetic makeup? where the artists could prosper more readily from their common linkages to local narratives. Japan, for example, is a large body of thought that once lay between Neptune and Pluto. It is well predicted that its inhabitants will invent a refined heating system, a knowledge that is forever lost, but first archived as a practice in the annals of Kabul Home Integration and Engineering University in the 5th century AD. Surely you see how sending artists to Germany is a grave mistake on your part. Given the bio-atmo-philosophispheric makeup of that site, they will merely become farmers, harvesting terrible rice that only mimic unreality. Upon their return, they opened great schools across the global north, now entirely polluted by the production of the global south for generations to come. Eating bad rice also led to new waves of tribalism, spreading exotic rituals, rightfully known as minimalism. This, of course, is partially due to the freezing of socialist realist monumental forests during the Ice Age, which back then led to conceptual art wildfires. We all know that lines, dots, and color are the basis for reality. But where's the fantasy in that? Why else would banking strategists subject their analysts to think in miniature grids, while plastic surrealism is filling up oceans everywhere? King Amanullah is gravely distressed by this unexpected evaluation. But why should Alexander, a conquering adventurer himself, a local Pathan, be allowed to lecture the king? Perhaps someone from an altogether different solar system, a woman of historical importance from the future, would have a fairer perspective. He tries to conjure Margaret Thatcher. But instead, Bibi Khadija, famously known for her heroic role as Prophet Muhammad's wise and wealthy wife, appears before him. If you want the opinion of a businesswoman, you might choose someone with a more pious reputation. Amanullah is taken back and respectfully submits all his attention. But to his surprise, Bibi Khadija's feedback is more critical than he had hoped for. I'm here to warn you about your terrible predicament of becoming the first filmmaker in the universe, and that your stubborn endeavor to document fiction through the moving image will likely have you expelled from kingly ranks forever. By introducing film to society, you initiated a new exercise which is as sacred as the sun, yet as provocative as cave paintings will become one day. Unleashing an army of filmmakers across the planet marks the beginning of the end of globalization. It is why we will not recognize folklore in the future, and why everything is reduced to food, fashion, and fasting. But worst of all, consequences is the airports everywhere will one day look and smell exactly alike. Having said this, Bibi Khadija quickly departs to make way for planet Uranus's notorious doctors, Mullah Nasruddin and Joseph Boyce, co-owners of a secret medical practice registered as Sufi Fluxus Production in the city of Ramallah Municipal Library. If you want to know more about this, you can look it up on Asia Art Archive. This was a presentation for Rashid Rana's invitation for us to imagine an exhibition somewhere in a different space of time with no objective and no actual objects. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to start actually by adding a word to my 3 words, and I do want to talk about my 3 words a little bit. Sorry, let me just make sure I have the right thing here. Yeah, the word I want to talk to you about is love.
Why is it that the most important, genuine thing that gets in something you love is the most cliched 3 words that you use?
Which are?
I love you. And they are true. They're not untrue. The cliche does not make them untrue. The cliche does not take away from their power. If I say I love you to somebody and not hear it back, it breaks you down. It's not simply a cliche, it's very powerful.
What would be? True ecstasy, Michael. Do you believe in it? I'm sure it exists. I'm sure I'll feel it.
Love is really actually the reason why I do what I do, and I think that as a curator, my work is actually an object lesson in love. I don't really make shows anymore of the nature of the sort of group show, the kind of, wonderful, I'm having some difficulty here, sorry, yeah, go ahead. You could just bring it up. Perfect. Thank you so much. So, in the last few years, I've really embraced what I think is my true calling, which is commissioning and residencies and direct artist support. I'm somewhere in the space between an exhibition maker and a grant maker, in the sense that I'm frequently re-granting funds to artists. And being in Santa Monica, I'm in the midst of a really interesting and multinational art community, but there's also an underrepresentation of the South Asian community across the West Coast in the artistic space. So what I'm going to do today is just show you some examples of work that I have been producing with artists of South Asian backgrounds over the last few years and coming up. This is just a very small fraction of my curatorial practice, and you're all welcome to Google me if you'd like to know more about other projects. They're all online. But I just want to focus today on what we're here to really think about, which is how can we mutually support each other, and how do we use the resources and opportunities that are available to us to do that in very direct, meaningful, and liberating ways. So, yes, again, we'll shout out our campus. So the first artist I'm going to talk about a little bit is Brendan Fernandez, and the word for Brendan here is action. We talked a lot about what it meant to be making a project over the course of the last year in a political cycle. When Brendan and I started working on this project in March of 2016, we were fairly optimistic. It was, it was the end of the Obama years. We were pretty sure that things were moving in a good direction. We were going to keep going that way. The metro was just about to arrive in Santa Monica, which had been taken away 30 years prior, basically by pressure from the car lobby. So for the first time in 30 years, you could ride a train directly from downtown Los Angeles to the beach. And so we wanted to respond to this because actually this is what you're seeing here is the bike path that was built right behind our campus at 18th Street. And so what Brendan did was I commissioned from him a new movement work in public space. What we did was guerrilla performance interventions using the metro line and the histories of displacement that accompanied its easement, the seizure of this land back in the 50s in order to build the 10th freeway, what's known as the Santa Monica Freeway. So we used a few different sites, that bike path behind our campus. We got on the train, we went and stopped downtown to the beach. This site is still relatively underdeveloped because now the train has been open for about a year. And we also used the back wall of our building. This is a mural that we commissioned from Brendan that is connected with the work. The overall body of work is called I'm Down, and it's about connecting language and bodies in public space. So I'm going to show you at the end, if I have time, maybe a little bit of that. But then the next word I want to talk to you about is developing. So we talk a lot about South Asia as a developing region. But for me, developing is really about supporting. And the trouble is in South Asia, we often find that the developing is more about extracting. Let's develop more resources that we can then appropriate, as opposed to how do we actually support, nurture, and redirect resources into development. So when I work with artists through visiting artist residencies or through commissions, we're really thinking about how do we develop those artists and help them to develop. And sometimes those artists seem to be quite developed already and very well exposed, and other times maybe not so much. And it doesn't matter really what point an artist is in their career. They always need space and time and freedom and resources to simply think about what they would like to do in a big way with their work, not just working to the next deadline, not just working to the next opportunity for visibility, but actually really truly working in innovative directions directed by their own internal practice and goals. So that's what we've been trying to do. Another thing I really want to point out, the last word I'm going to talk about is communal. And communal, to me, is really about not distinguishing so firmly between South Asian and the South Asian American, because we're constantly going back and forth. So I did a residency with the artist Mitu Sen recently, who's based in New Delhi, and she hasn't spent a lot of time in LA, but yet she showed up and she knew everybody. And I'm working now with the artist Neha Choksi, and Neha, is she an American artist? Is she a South Asian artist? Well, she was born in South Asia, she studied in England, she lived in LA, she went to live in Mumbai for a decade, now she's in LA again. But half the time she's in Mumbai. Where does that make her? What does that make us? So I think these are really important questions to ask. How can we support one another, and how can we use the institutions and build the institutions that we collectively need? Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to talk about a few concepts that I've been developing, inspired by the work of artists that I've worked with very recently through residencies, a residency program that I run at the Hyde Park Art Center, a community-based art space in Chicago, or through my independent projects. Unlearning. Unlearning is an essential process we can use to deprogram, first ourselves, and through our work, others. Unlearning is understanding the structures and then taking them down piece by piece. It is the work of equity, of anti-racism. It's challenging norms, English as the lingua franca, that we're individuals, that we're objective, and that kids don't belong in the workplace. It's beginning to manifest other realities, finding detail, deepening nuance. It's the ever-timely practice of resisting binaries, abstraction versus representation, worker versus artist, artist versus mother, and the stubborn one, self versus other. It's reasserting the inadequacy of monoliths, and refusing to make our work a bureaucratic process, turning away from efficiency, multitasking, success, and perfection. Unlearning opens us up to failure, the joys of failure. Arundhati Roy has an anecdote about her uncle who gave her a treat, who offered her a treat as a very young child, only if she could prove to him that she had failed at something. It's not in children too much, and instead watching them carefully to see how learning comes so naturally to them through doing and making mistakes, which aren't mistakes at all, but lessons more than anything for us. It's the undisciplining of the body and the mind, forgetting that we've learned how to paint or dance or write and massaging away the muscle memory, breaking up the fascia, and paving way for new learning. Unlearning is reconnecting to our ancestors who are still able to teach us about making and knowing and being, even though they're not around. It's the daily practice of rediscovering our senses and activating our intuition to plant the seeds for a new paradigm. If we're lucky, this might lead to invention. So this is an image of living root bridges, which are found in the northeastern part of the Indian Himalayas, that Sanjeev Shankar, an artist, architect, scientist, explorer, has been studying for the past several years. So these bridges are grown by indigenous tribes through a really unique process of weaving the tree roots when the roots are young and nimble. So over time, their load-bearing capacity expands at a very slow rate. Once mature, these bridges are incredibly robust under the harshest of conditions, and they're capable of supporting various plant and animal life. Shankar's work wants to understand this practice, which he views as a deeply philosophical one, because it collapses the separation completely between people and nature, between art and life practices. So the bridges provide a model of symbiosis and resilience among living things of vastly different scales, moving from the idea of an individual practice to a communal practice. Because the bridges take decades to mature and can live for centuries, the practice must be passed down between generations through a process of making together. So one generation begins the structure that only their grandchildren will be able to use. So it explodes the idea of enjoying the fruits of one's own labor. And it's a collective form of weaving that's essential to this community's survival. Finally, generosity. Generosity can bridge the broken pieces. Unlearning undoes, then comes the remaking of the muscle. inside the fibers. It's understanding how to make an invitation to your guests on their terms and in their language, and learning how to be a host. It's being in service of our publics, not our institutions. Collaboration is a tricky one because it often means two unequal partners, one of whom receives most of the funding and the credit for a project and relies on individuals who can, quote unquote, come together to do things. Instead, I'm interested in understanding how we can build a platform that's shared from the beginning, where we don't need to bestow any credit and instead participate at the outset in a process of we. Generosity is being together, living in close proximity, as messy as that can get. It's the daily commitment to equitable practices. As the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire says, no one educates anyone, no one educates himself. We educate each other, mediated by the world. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. I don't normally write things out, but I actually did for once. So here it is. Everyone in this room has privilege. We all had the wherewithal to come here to the Queen's Museum today via train, car, bus, whatever, however we chose to come here. Even before getting here, we all had access to the information about this convening. I'm making a lot of assumptions, but I'm guessing that we can all read, that we all have a unique vantage point and mental space to think about the concerns of our community beyond our individual selves and our survival. These are privileges, not in a bad way, though there has been a great overarching and overreaching advantage, dominance, hierarchy, and violence. There isn't one monolith of privilege. There are grades, shades, and intersections. I think we can all safely acknowledge that the very dominant space that cis, white, straight men occupy and the overwhelming access and mongering of privilege that they have. But this conversation is not directly about whiteness or heteronormativity, though it does shape almost every facet of our lives as non-cisgender, straight, white people. This conversation is about us and how, in our awareness of privileges, we can use them as an asset and a tool not only for ourselves, but as a means to convene with communities, cultivate conversations, and create equitable spaces and opportunities both because of and in spite of that which makes us different. That's me. My curatorial practice is based on this idea of equality and creating equitable space. Project for Empty Space, which I co-founded in 2010 with Meenakshi Thirukode and now run with Rebecca Jampol, is at its heart a nomadic project and has a main gallery in Newark, New Jersey that is dedicated to the idea of equitability by providing artists with opportunities and space to create work that aims to engage communities and expose inequalities, and its dedication to actively creating dialogues within communities about issues that are often ignored by the mainstream. I came to this place from a very personal space. I am brown, obviously, South Asian, and though it may not be physically apparent, I do have an autoimmune disease. I suffer from sometimes debilitating depression and anxiety. I was diagnosed along with many of my peers with ADHD as a child, which now, as an adult, I like to think of as multitasking, for whatever that means. But it did nothing for my confidence as a child. The way I learned to cope with these things, to come into my own, and to love myself, speaking of love, is quite frankly and probably very cliche sounding, was through art and art history. If you ask my mother, she'll say I started curating at the age of 5 when I opened a Sackler gallery on our front porch in the DC suburbs. So where does my privilege come in? There, with loving parents who sent me to a great school, which is perhaps one that forced us to think critically about everything. I can't remember an important date or name for my life, but it made me acutely aware of my privilege, and it was a school that urged us to give back. It is our duty as people with access to education, to resources, and to global platforms to use this advantage to help other people. And I know this sounds ideal. When I realized at some point that other people were plagued with the same issues that I was, I started creating shows about them and about us. It was extremely cathartic. But I realized later that preaching to the converted is only one part of what's important. Creating dialogue amongst each other is important, but it's not enough. We must also start a dialogue with those who do not acknowledge our existences or recognize the prejudices and problems and violence that harm us, often to the point of non-existence. So I went from creating shows for and about myself to trying to create shows that are both for us, about us, but also for other people to see who we are when others refuse to acknowledge our existences. The two ideas are not mutually exclusive. We can revel in a world and celebrate our lives and acknowledge our struggles while also sharing them with the world. In my efforts as a curator, I've tried to achieve both. To create exhibitions that are legible on multiple levels, both at the surface but also beneath the surface, because the work good artists create goes well beyond their cosmetics. Work is nuanced and layers as the people making it. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm actually out of time. I've recently started creating happenings, public happenings, although I despise the title for myself as artist because I don't consider myself an artist. But in doing what I do it because I want to reiterate that as a curator, it is important to give voice to the issues to people who don't actually know them. We will teach them, we will tell them that Black Lives Matter, no matter what they say. We won't just tell them, we will show them and we will stuff it down their throats until they get it. Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. We matter. Rape culture is real. The conflation of economics, race, and gender identity do work in collusion to put us to a further disadvantage. In fact, they put everyone at a further disadvantage, whether or not we realize it in real time. And that's what I do, what I do.
So, firstly, my apologies for not having prepared the kind of amazing presentation that the other curators have prepared. It's mainly because I have been preparing everything else for this convening. So what I'm going to do is actually use the curatorial section from my website to talk about projects. So I'm going to begin with what is my vision and why do I curate? And like Jasmine, it is always a personal kind of process that you go through. I'm not a trained curator, and as a matter of fact, we were in conversation 2 nights ago and talking about the things that trained curators do, which is research and write essays and wall labels and all of those things which are incredibly important, and those are the things I like doing the least. I really think of curating as an extension of my own artistic practice, and I look at it as what is it that I'm trying to tell as a story together? What are the things that I can communicate through telling the story to people? And really, my focus when I curate is not the white art world ever. I'm always curating shows thinking that this is exactly the audience that is going to be receiving my work. And I myself grew up in India, in a small town. I didn't move here till I was 15 years old, to a neighborhood really close to here. And so my encounter with contemporary art has always been a very, very fraught one. And I respond to works that are emotional, that are visceral, that are experiential, that don't rely on an academic formal jargon to actually get across what they're trying to do. And this is really the crux of everything that I put together, whether it's Fatal Love or a trilogy of science fiction-based feminist exhibitions I had curated in London. They were called Anomalies, Shapeshifters and Aliens, and Stargazing. The Emo Show, Loving Blackness, and of course Lucid Dreams and Distant Visions. The challenge for me is to always create a show that the audience members feel in their body, that they feel emotionally, and that they don't actually have to come to with an insider knowledge of Western contemporary art, because frankly, that leaves the majority of the general public out of the equation. And I'm not interested in addressing such a tight little audience. So really what I'm going to focus on in this specific presentation is a project that I did called the Emo Show in 2013 at the Elizabeth Foundation. What I did for this exhibition is I brought together 6 curators of color, including Jasmine Wahi, who's here. The other 2 women were Rocio Aranda Alvarado from El Museo del Barrio and Maimuna Farhat, who's an independent artist and critic and curator. The men included Derek Adams, who's primarily an artist but had a background in curating at Rush Arts, Edwin Ramoran, and Raul Zamadio. So with these 6 curators, I basically sat down and I talked to them about the disconnect that I feel when I walk into generally contemporary art exhibitions. And I said to them that I wanted to create this show based on the Indian aesthetic theory called Rasa theory. And Rasa theory is something that has been around for several millennia. And what it talks about is that every art object, every song, every piece of theater, every film is a communication between the maker and the receiver. And it's not just a formal academic exercise, it is an emotional transference as well. So Rasa theory over the millennia has been codified to the point where colors are associated with emotion. So within Rasa theory, green is the color of love, red is the color of anger, white is the color of mirth, of laughter, black is the color of death, and so on and so forth. So these colors refer to emotions. So when I got the 6 curators together, I said to them that I want you to think about the 3 most emotionally impactful works that you can remember. What moved you so deeply as a work of art that you remembered it, you felt it within your body, you carried its memory with you, and I want you to give me these works. So all the curators came together, we made a list of artists, we discussed specific works, and then we sat down and we discussed the emotions that each work elicited. We decided what the primary emotion of the work was and then categorized it in that way. So when we presented the exhibition, all the works that dealt with wonder were together. All the works that dealt with humor were together. All the works that dealt with valor, here are Jasmine's selections on the gold wall. They were together. The green works, which include Hiba Shabazz, who I see here. That was the wall of love. You can see behind it the gray wall of tension. And there's a tiny little blue fragment you can see here. And that was a really powerful piece of the carcass of a pig underwater being devoured by sharks. And that is what the show ended with. And the way I laid the exhibition out was so that you could enter the exhibition with more superficial emotions And as you walked through and ended up in the last space, that's where you encountered the most terrifying emotions. So this was, to me, an approach to curating that I wanted to share with my colleagues, and it's what moves me, and that's how I approach things. And that's all I'm gonna have to say for today. Thank you so much.
So for the rest of the panel, there's going to be a loop, PowerPoint loop playing. That is a collection of images from each of the panelists that sent them to me. And this slide with the words on it will also come up periodically. So before I invite everyone up, I am just going to share a very short meditation on the 3 words that I chose that were in some ways a response to the conversation that we had over Skype when we were planning this. These are not going to be in full sentences. So, intersectional, inside and outside and in between, where 2 points cross, where we live, where we make, where we strive to bring others. Imagination, what allows us to grow, what opens up the possibilities and the spaces we need, what invites others into those possibilities, how we understand ourselves, where we find our creative practice, a place of hope. Intimacy, a human necessity, the place of exchange, a place of quiet transformation, where we define who we care about and what we care about, and a process of understanding each other. Becoming each other, I am you, you are me, they are us, we are them, that's what makes us we. And with that, I welcome all of the panelists to come sit up at the table so we can talk about this a little. So thanks everybody for sharing your thoughts and meditations. And it just should be mentioned that the women on this panel are curators. They're also artists, they're also organizers, they're also entrepreneurs in this space of creating time, creating care for this experience of diaspora that we're all gathered here to talk about today and over the next 2 days. So we have about 15 minutes. So I sent questions out to the group before, so I'm going to start with the first question, because I think it actually speaks to a lot of the things that you said, which is, what is urgent to you right now in your practice, whether it's as an artist or as a curator, or being a participant in the art world, or being an Asian American? I think we're in a moment where urgency is something a lot of us are thinking about in many aspects of our lives. So I want to hear from each of you about that. Shall I start? Okay. Maulana Sardine would say, this is way too much thinking. I think what's urgent is, for me, is to trust my, and ask questions from my more internal space, and so for that I need to create a lot of self-care. And when I am taking care of myself, I end up being quite incredibly thoughtful and responsible for every aspect of what I plan. I become incredibly attentive to not only what I'm going to present, but how I'm going to be responsible for the audience and how they're going to receive it, because I think that's one of the most problematic aspects of institutional presentations, is assuming that
the audience is just going to be able to receive things without actual communication with them ahead of time about what they're going to receive, how much is going to be expected of them, and how they should prepare themselves to receive it, which is something for me. I learned that when I pay attention to not only curating the program but also the audience, I am able to truly make a very special, energetic environment for everyone to sort of like feast from each other's amazing creativity, rather than just sort of like be there and be flat and sometimes bored or frustrated or annoyed. So I think the urgency in curating is first taking care of ourselves as women, because generally as women we're, we leave ourselves last. We think about everybody else first. And so that's something that is quite difficult, but I've been trying to do for the past few years, and it's showing in my work.
So I think self-care is extremely important. I would add to that I think we're in an interesting situation as a community in the sense that we have, on the one hand, a lot of opportunity and a lot of visibility in some particular spaces at the moment, and on the other hand, not very much freedom. And so my two goals are, on the one hand, to create as much freedom as possible, and I don't limit that freedom that I'm creating exclusively to artists of any one background. But I think it's extremely important that I make a point of prioritizing South Asian artists within that, as I've shown you. But the other side of that, because a lot of times that freedom can result in outcomes that are somewhat ephemeral or long-term, or not so visible right away, is the scholarship and the rigor that's created around that. So what I try to do is to create a frame that is historical, that is culturally diverse, that brings in information from a variety of thought traditions, all of which is active in the work that the artists do, but so rarely is it expressed in the articulation of what artists are doing by critics and curators and historians. And I see myself in all of those camps. I do write criticism, I do try more and more to build a historical grounding for the work that I do in exhibitions as well as in writing. And when I make these projects with artists, I'm thinking long term. I'm thinking, it's because of patronage that we have art history, and so what kind of patronage can I create that's responsible and ethical, that allows artists to operate ethically and sustainably in our field?
I guess what I was going to say, I think in contrast to what Lisa was saying, was that I, and speaking of privilege, am not as concerned with the audience's response to the work. I'm more interested in bringing the work and not apologizing for the work and the artists, and having to, I think, perhaps dumb down the work for audiences or compromise what the artists I who I work with are trying to get across. That being said, I don't work in an institutional space. I work very intentionally in spaces that perhaps are affrontive to some people, and in public spaces, in a space that doesn't really have a demographic, which is why I chose it. So for me, the urgency is creating work in visible spaces in spite of the audience, so that the general public has to contend with our place as people of color, as queer people. They must contend with the work that we're doing.
I think it's vital that each of us recognize where we have places of power. Curating is a position of power, there's no question. We have a certain amount of agency, we have a certain amount of ability, whether you're working institutionally or not. You are organizing and bringing people together, but every single one of us in this room has places where you have power centers. You have an ability to make change, and I think what's really urgent right now is that we all recognize that that's going to manifest itself in a variety of ways, a variety of volume. Some of you may be working quietly, some of you may be working more visibly and actively, some of you may be doing it through your artwork, or you may be doing it more publicly, like Jasmine's projects, but whatever you're doing right now is going to be important, like the bridge building that Mega talked about. It's about building something for the next generations. And we're here because somebody cleared space for us, and it's important for us to use our power centers to clear space for others down the road.
I want to hand this to Meg, but I have to say, I don't think I'm here because anyone cleared space for me. I think I'm here because I took space, and I continue to hold space and then make that space for others. Like you took that night.
I really agree with a lot of what you're saying. I guess to add anything, there's a lot of effort that's required, I think, in understanding what the paradigm is and how it operates, and then figuring out how to change it. I think in terms of an institution of any size and any kind of scale, I feel like what's probably most urgent in my work is trying to shift the level of nuance that we can bring to the artist's work that we are presenting. So thinking about the tradition, the process, the various deep levels that go into making the work philosophically, methodologically, formally, and allowing all of those to come to light. So to be more specific, if anyone has read recently Zadie Smith's recent piece in the New Yorker about Lynette Udam Boachle's exhibition, I thought that was a really beautiful, basically, she was able to bring such a deep level of understanding of the work and its kind of cultural backing, as well as the implications that it's able to kind of have for the field of painting, which I felt like that's what I want to do. That's what the work is that I'd like to be able to do, and I think that we're in a position to be able to be going forward. The exhibition, by the way, is at the New Museum currently.
So I think for me there are two urgencies. One that I could identify in the larger field of curating, which would be, I don't know, it seems like the art world's complete disconnect from the general public, and how can we actually get curators to give a shit about the diverse audiences that lie outside their door. How do we actually, so I'm going to talk about the survey that Tom Finkelpearl did about, what percentage of arts administrators in cultural institutions are minorities, are women, are Asian American, and you see across the board that in every institution, the top people are white, the curators, the decision makers, the boards are all white. And so they're looking at us and thinking that they have to check off tiny little diversity boxes where the larger equation remains white. But what I would like to see is actually how are we going to get those white people out of power, get them to give up their power to give us spaces. That's what I want to know. Well, how can we parlay our individual power into larger institutional power? And how can we build sustainability? Because we have people here who've been around through Desh Pradesh in Toronto in the 90s, who've been in London through the Black and Asian arts movement in the 80s, and we've seen actually the collapse of those movements, and because of the lack of funding and all of these things. So how can we learn from these lessons and build different frameworks that may be more successful or longer lasting, or not dependent on problematic funding models? I mean, those are the questions that I'd like to look at.
I think most people in this room already have heard this statement before, but I'll just reiterate it. And I want to shout out to the Queen's Museum because you guys do a great job. But if you want to have more diversity in your museums, it starts with your staff and your administration. So let us, right. It does not mean that the people we see in the museums that look like us are the guards or the custodial staff.
Or the assistant curators. Sorry, they don't have any powers.
it is by having us there. And I will also, I will agree with you. For me, the only avenue that I felt was my way into the institutional space was by acquiescing to the antiquities or contemporary South Asian market based primarily on my background. So I had to make my own space within this world. I never wanted to be a business owner. I just wanted to make shows. But I had to make my space in this world because of the types of shows that I wanted to make that weren't just about being South Asian or being Indian. And that's not just an imposition of mainstream culture or white culture, but also within our culture. A certain expectation that if you are a cultural worker, you will be doing the work of this sort of monolith of what your culture is supposed to be.
I'm really trying not to react and be very calm. It's difficult because we, you know, have this opportunity to really, from a very personal place, share where we're at in the struggles that we have to go through to make something really positive happen. I think that I want to acknowledge the fact that the reason why we're here is because it's 20 years later, and you know, where are we now? And sometimes I feel that we can emotionally be in a different place, almost like as if we were 20 years ago, more than our reality is. That's not to say that the reality is not pretty effed up. We're all aware of it, and but for me, the work is to allow the actual conversations that are being made and the research that are being taken place by the artists to take form and allow that to shine through, rather than make overarching statements about things on my own. I think paying attention to the artists and their work from across all regions of Asia, and actually seeing the shift that has happened across the museums in New York. In my position, working just as director of Asia Contemporary Art Week, I can tell you that just 5 years ago, it was impossible to say Lebanon and China in the same room. Like, people would look at you like, why are you talking about Lebanon and why are you speaking about China? And there was absolutely no connection between the two. And yet we have Art Asia Pacific now writing about Qatari artists. For whatever reason it is, it's actually the work of all of us, each and every one of us. All of us have paved the way, have worked our butts off with meager resources, with awful shoestring budgets, and with the effort and incredible tenacity of the artists across Asia to make that shift. So I do want to remind us to be very acknowledging of our work, and make sure that, you know, we ourselves are aware of the shift that has happened, so that we can take it to the next level. No one is going to give it to us. We can't demand it. We're going to have to make it happen, and that's just the way that it is. And I encourage us in that road.
Super fast. Just a little bit of history. I would like everybody to remember that Vishaka Desai paved the way for some of us to have a place at the table. And also museum educators like Vas Prabhu, who was an incredible mentor to many people working in museum education in the early 90s. So do keep in mind that we are here because people like the two of them, and I'm not naming everyone, but that's what I mean by, you know, historicity. We have to have, that's what curators do, we're historians too. So keep that in mind.
Well, we've run out of time. Excuse me.
Quickly, can I just acknowledge one person in the audience? I'd love to give a shout out to Vijay Kumar. Vijay has also been organizing shows in the community for a very long time. And he has supported so many artists in his decades of working. So please, everybody, do find Vijay when you have a chance and talk to him. He's the most wonderful person.
While the mic's on, I just want to leave everybody with a call to action. We have to build things together. And we have to not only ask, how can we get into the museum, but how do we get the museum out of the museum and into the street? So, the museum is a base of operations. The museum is perhaps a tactical headquarters, but the museum is not where the audience is. The audience is in the world.
So I just first want to say thank you to all of you. This was incredible, and we touched on a lot of the things we talked about in our dialogue. I had a bunch of other questions, but I'm going to leave everybody and you all with this question. I encourage you to come speak with any of these women over the next few days. They're totally incredible. So the question that I kind of want to leave everybody with is, given the conversation we've had today, who is our responsibility to, and what is our responsibility to our diaspora? When I say our diaspora, I mean everybody in this room, because people who are not South Asian help shape the diaspora that we experience. And how does that speak to the future of curating? So with that, thank you guys very much.
Okay, and thank you to all the panelists and the moderator for keeping to our 1 hour time limit. I appreciate that. So we are going to take about a 5-minute break to just set up for the next panel. Feel free to use the facilities, etc. But we're going to try and be really quick. So if we to start in 5-10 minutes with the concerning sculpture panel. And then what we'll probably do, since we're running a little over time and just to save a little time, is there's a 1 hour lunch break right now. The performance by Basira Khan, we're actually going to move later to the coffee break time at 5. And so then we can kind of do a 45-minute lunch period instead of an hour, and we can save up a little bit of time that way so that we can get back on track. So we'll be starting the sculpture panel in just about 5 to 10 minutes. Thanks.